I'm Jody.
And I'm Kat.
And you're listening to Felons and Families.
Jody and Kat are not lawyers, nor are they therapists. The following conversations are based on work and life experiences. The information and advice provided are opinions only and should not replace the advice that can be obtained from a lawyer or licensed therapist.
Okay, welcome to Felons and Families. Trigger warning, this episode will discuss issues involving domestic violence, so take self-care. So as an officer, I would, again, deal with families, but what strikes me sometimes is the overwhelming emotions that come from, like a wife, for instance. A story I'm about to tell, what women, particularly as women, wives, go through when their loved one gets arrested or is returning to custody. And just before I retired, I had a defendant that had been on supervision for 5 years. He was looking forward to about 8 months more. Then he'd finally be off. He was finally going to be a free man. He did such a great job on supervision, to my knowledge. He was a truck driver. He was a loving father, a loving husband. I loved watching the family dynamic. I remember when his son graduated from high school, and this was just as we were reopening from 2020, the shutdown. And so, of course, we weren't testing people, so I had to call my people in to test. And I remember being a little nervous, hoping that he was going to test clean, so he wouldn't get in any more trouble.
Yeah, you're really rooting for this guy.
I didn't want him to do anything that was going to end up causing him to stay on supervision any longer. And he tested clean, and he was so proud because his son was graduating from high school, and he was going to be the first person to graduate in his entire family from high school. Yeah. So it was a real marker for him. And he had bought his own diesel truck. He was going to start his own business. He was really excited about that. I knew that he had bought a motorcycle that him and his wife were enjoying together. So I was just really loving the success of this family and of this man. And within a week and a half of my retiring, he gets arrested.
Oh, no.
And I so wanted to believe his story, even though it sounded like such BS. One way that made me think that it was true, because his wife was in the car. And as he's telling me the story, she's talking about her knowledge in the background, and she was helping me want so badly for this to be true. Mm-hmm. But as a trained officer, I'm like, the story doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound logical. I'm thinking something's wrong. And I have to go through the course of my job and get a copy of the police report. And I'm reading it, and my heart's just sinking.
Oh, no.
It's just sinking. And without going into too many details, because, of course, we're going to have millions of people listening, and I don't want the off chance that somebody would recognize who this person is. But the bottom line is he had a very long criminal history that included some prior charges of felon in possession of a firearm. And he was caught with a firearm. He tried to claim that it was a mistaken identity. He had thrown the gun away. There was a foot pursuit. But the evidence looked pretty stacked against him. Mm-hmm. And when I called him in, probably the first time in my career, obviously he couldn't answer any more questions because he had an open case that's not adjudicated, which just means that the new case for the gun has to go through the system and, be found guilty or innocent or whatnot. So it wasn't okay for him to speak to me about it. But as I explained to him why I think that this is probably him and what that does to jeopardize his time on supervision with us and what's about to happen, for the first time, I actually allowed myself to get choked up because I'm just looking at this. He was supposed to be the person that's I think of in retirement as succeeding. Oh. And at one point I got a phone call from his wife, and the ache in her voice, knowing that she wasn't going to have me much longer, that she had developed a relationship with me, and she just wanted the hard, cold truth, facts, what she might be looking at. Mm-hmm. She needed to start making arrangements, getting prepared for that financially. She was going to be stuck yet again with these boys. And now this brand new diesel truck with payments due, and she's not a truck driver. My heart just sank for her. But also, I think to myself, didn't she know? Didn't she know that he had a gun?
Yeah.
Did she really not know? I always wondered about that.
Well, there's a lot into that situation right there. Does she know? Does she not know? I was in a domestic violence relationship for 7 years, and a lot of stuff I knew and a lot of stuff I didn't. There was one time that my ex had been absconding for 5 years. And for those of you that don't know, it's failure to report to a probationer or parole officer after release. So basically, he was on the run for 5 years. Now, during those 5 years, did he commit some crimes? Probably. Did I know about them all? No. But our house ended up getting raided. And when I say raided, I mean guns drawn. They had been following me around, ATVs in the backyard, and our roommate on the ground with guns pointed at his head for mistaken identity of my ex. Did I know that there was pot in the house at the time? Yeah, I did. So what did I do? I turned around and hid it in the back of the toilet. I wasn't going to get caught with it. I didn't smoke the weed. I had nothing to do with the weed, but I knew it was there. And that was a small thing, a little bit, well, it was more than a little bit of marijuana. It was about a brick.
Okay.
Did I know that? Yeah, I did. But then in another instant, he had a friend that liked to cause trouble with him. And I knew this. So whenever he was in town, I'd always keep my distance. And one night in the middle of the night, I woke up and my ex wasn't in bed. So I went around the house to go find him. And I opened up the garage door, and there he is with his friend and another gentleman, all huddled around a pile of cash. I'm talking a pile of cash.
Mm.
Now, you got to understand, I'm a young mother, barely 21 years old, in domestic violence. So I had a choice to make. Do I say something? Do I question what's going on and risk getting beat, or becoming part of the crime that they committed? I decided to close the door and never speak of it again, so I could have some plausible deniability. I don't know what happened, and I don't want to know. So, there's a way to protect yourself, and maybe she didn't want to know that he had the gun.
Right. That is true. That is a really important point to be made, and it scares me in a way, because as an officer, I did have women, hint to me that there was a problem, or reach out to me and let me know that there was a problem in their relationship, and I could get involved as much as I could with my defendant, try to get him anger management and that sort of thing. So it frightens me to think that some of these women, of course, if the domestic violence is that bad, that they may not feel comfortable to even tell their officer.
Yeah, and there's a stigma with domestic violence, and unfortunately for a lot of us women, we don't reach out until it's too late.
Yeah, that's frightening to think about. But of course, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you've got a husband or a significant other that's doing a meth lab. She doesn't probably have much options especially if she's in a domestic violence situation. And I'd go even so far as to say that there's other reasons. For instance, lots of times women are with a poor partner, a toxic relationship, but are financially feeling very dependent and trapped.
Oh, yeah.
And again, another reason why they just turn a blind eye, hope for the best. Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah, becoming financially dependent on another person can also be a form of domestic, violence or control.
Correct. Yeah. Right. And even verbal abuse, where you feel you don't feel emotionally strong. Maybe now you're depressed. You just lack even the motivation.
Yeah, and there's no way you're going to reach out to that person's PO and tell them what's going on for
Right.
For fear.
Right. And it's difficult, because that would be another thing that would happen as an officer, is that you'd call me with this problem, but then say, I don't want you to tell him.
Oh, yeah. And
how am I supposed to have an open dialogue with the defendant to find out if these problems exist, if I'm not allowed to tell him anything? The easier ones were, calling me and saying, hey, I think this person's using again. Well, That's easy. I can blindly test you. The only thing I could do in those circumstances is show up more and see if I catch them in a fight or something like that. But it just is really difficult. And so thankfully, there's programs out there that are anonymous and can provide some support, which I'm sure we'll make sure you're aware of by the end of this episode. But I think you make some really good points, and it's really something that needs to be looked at as well. When you talked about the raids, and for me, it was the words were search. It was arrest and search. And it's funny because, of course, on the streets, it's more like called a raid.
Yeah,
right?
On the other end. Oh, yeah, it's never an arrest and search. It's
right.
a raid, when guns are drawn and the neighbors are looking, and you got somebody in your front yard with a gun to their head, and the cops, busted in the doors looking for their person. It definitely feels like a raid. It's so funny that the distance between the wording.
Yes. I could see that. I would meet, and I bring up women because it tended to be women, the spouses tended to be the women, the men tended to be the ones going into custody. Yeah. So obviously that can change and different family dynamics, but the women would often have PTSD. Now the person's out of custody. Now the person's on supervision. And I could see how nervous they were about the raid, worrying about a raid happening at any time.
Yeah.
And I would always have to try to get them to understand that it doesn't necessarily work like that on supervision. We're not just going to show up in the middle of the night and search your place. Unless that can happen if he's still doing some wrongdoings out there.
I remember being paranoid about, a PO coming, and we have knives in the kitchen because, a lot of times parolees, probationers are not supposed to have any weapons in the home. Well, I mean, cutting knives, kitchen knives, they can be constituted as a weapon. Just depend, that's the fear. That's
right.
The rationality that's going through your mind. Like if they come, they can look at the kitchen drawer and say, well, this house is full of weapons.
No, I've heard that. I've heard that as well. Just for the listeners out there, the way it's supposed to work is if your butcher knife that you use to cut vegetables and stuff is in your kitchen in a butcher block, no problem. But if it's sitting underneath your cushion on your couch, now it's a weapon.
Oh, okay. Well, I can see that.
Right.
That makes sense.
Another way to look at it is if your baseball bat is with your mitt and your ball and where you like to store that, no problem. But if your baseball bat is sitting behind your door, your front door, well, it might be a weapon now.
Oh, I better tell my kids to move their bat. It has a sock on it too. Is that okay?
Well, you're not on supervision, so I think you're fine. My husband has a bat near his bed, and that's not because we play baseball. So, I mean, that's kind of what an officer is supposed to be looking for. Yeah. But back to the emotions that come from a raid, I imagine that you have to explain something to your children depending on the age. And I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, not just about experiences from a raid, but also just the fact that your loved one has gotten arrested, is maybe now has been sentenced, is now facing custody. I think depending on the length of time they're going to be gone, depending on the age of the children, that a decision has to get made on what you're telling the children.
Yeah, I agree. Now, luckily for me in my situation, my daughter was barely talking. She was still in diapers. So she wasn't fully aware of the situation and what was going on. Was she scared? Yeah. Was I scared? Yeah. But does she remember it now? No. So moving forward with the discussion, I think, like you said, age appropriate, what do we tell the children?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite ones, the very creative ones is, and I don't know how he orchestrated this, but he managed to, and I can't remember the age of the children, but I remember thinking that they had to have been old enough to understand or figure it out, but still it was masterful. So he was going to be in Lompoc, and so they'd come up to visit him, and he explained that he was working on a highly classified something, and it dealt with chemicals, and that it's highly classified, which is why he's not allowed to leave. And that's why they had to go through security. And that's why there's so many guards everywhere, because it's so classified. And that what you're seeing here is my work suit to keep me safe from the using of the chemicals. And this is our break room. The visiting room was the break room.
Genius.
It was masterful, but now he's on supervision. And how are you going to explain me? And I just couldn't wrap my brain around the fact that the kids are going to grow up and watch some show, something is going to trigger that every so many months for 3 years, you went to this place that daddy's working. He never got to come home for anything, for any holidays or birthdays. At some point, they're going to recognize that.
Yeah, or, whenever they can read, that might start triggering something as well. Correctional facility, what is that? And start questioning, how long do you put up the facade for?
Right. I don't know. And another case, the kids were lied to. The kid became suspicious of something, probably my visits, and decided to Google his dad. And everything popped right up. Everything, because it happened to be a big case, and everything popped up. And he was very angry with his father for not telling him the truth.
I have a story of somebody that when their child's father went off to prison, the children were relatively young, maybe 5, 6, around there. They had explained that he went to the North Pole to go work with Santa. Well, they started to question, how long can they work with Santa for? And as they got older, they realized that they had been completely lied to. And they were hurt, angry.
That's crazy.
Santa.
Work for Santa. Wow. I think that depending again on the children's age. So let's explore that. If the child's 2 or 3, obviously you're not going to come in with serious detail. What would you imagine saying to a child?
I would probably explain that, daddy or mommy, whoever's incarcerated at the time, has gone to do something important, that they love them, and that they'll be home as soon as they can be.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
Important just means later. If they ask later, it just means paying his debt to society.
Yeah, it was something important that had to be done.
Right. But as children get older, I think it's important to just go ahead and tell them what's going on.
Yeah, especially with access to the internet. I mean, kids aren't stupid. Kids are very tech savvy. They'll find out.
Right. Also, it can help you because children tend to rally. If they know what's going on, they understand money is going to be tight for this time period because of this problem. They tend to rally. Instead of fighting you, they're working with you. So I think trusting your kids.
Yeah, and there's a lesson there for your children as well.
Yes.
Don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time.
Right.
And that you have to be held responsible for their own actions, just like their parent does.
Yeah. I think trusting our kids, I think assuming that they can't handle something is not probably the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's guilt and shame involved with your spouse or a loved one getting into the system, getting incarcerated. But as a lot of people know that we say in recovery, we're only as sick as our secrets.
Yeah. Yes, I'm into that. Well, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that there's help out there for victims of domestic violence and their families. You can always call the National Domestic Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 and reach out for help if you need it.
Thank you. That's very important. Well, we have lots to discuss, but we want to hear from you as well. If you have a story regarding this topic that you would like to share, or you have a topic of your own, please email us at faf@felonsandfamilies.com. That's F as in Frank, A as in Apple, F as in Frank, @felonsandfamilies.com. Next week, we're going to discuss the stigma, the embarrassment of being on supervision or being arrested or having to go into custody. If you like us, help us out by subscribing. You can hear this podcast on all ways that you can get podcasts. I'm Jody.
And I'm Kat.
And this is Felons and Families.